Hello and welcome. My name is Andrew Macklin. I'm an actor and qualified career coach, and I'm doing a series of talks on what it is to live well as a creative in the world today. And I'm delighted to be joined, after a busy day's work, no doubt, by Julie Kelleher, who is the current artistic director of the Mermaid Arts Centre in Wicklow, a former artistic director of the Everyman in Cork. And I won't go through the full CV, Julie, because it's quite elongated, but I'll make sure to put it into the YouTube comments at the end. But thanks for joining me. How was your day so far?
Thanks for having me. My day was good, thank you. Yeah, I'm in week 4 of my new role in Bray, so lots of feeling like I'm catching up still, but in the best possible way. Mm-hmm. I think loads to do. That suits me. That's a good space for me to be in.
Fantastic. It sounds like you're it sounds like you're jumping in with a hunger. It sounds like, as opposed to, overwhelm, it feels like this is familiar territory and you're getting your teeth stuck.
Yeah, at least now, and it was interesting to land and go. I know that the role was going to be a little different to the one I held in Cork, because there is more executive responsibilities alongside it. So alongside the kind of programming and presenting and managing artist relationships and those things that I would have done. But I did have the lovely experience of going, I know how to do some of this stuff, because I suppose I hadn't been programming really, through the last 6 months. We've been dismantling program and kind of closing things down. So just that switch of rhythm to feeling like you're being productive rather than the opposite is, it's been very buzzy feeling to be doing, even in the small way. Like, our capacity is tiny, we're doing small shows, like only a couple of nights a week, those kinds of things. But even that feels really good.
I can imagine. I think there's a lot of people who are looking for that similar sense of, let me get back into doing the things that I have been doing, and to kind of satisfy that stuff. But it sounds like, it sounds delightful. We talked a little bit or mentioned briefly narrative before we started. And so I wonder then, in relation to, because you've had quite the career that has moved in, I guess, from an outside perspective, lots of different poles and positions and whatnot. But what would be the sort of inciting incident? What was that moment, I guess, as a young person, either between 16 and 25, that kind of block, that for you was the real moment of, I definitely do want to work as a professional in the theatre or in arts?
Yeah, I mean, I think making the decision to study theatre was really important. And it just so happened that when I was doing my leaving cert, a degree course came on stream in UCC, because otherwise I think I would have done an English degree, which would have suited me well, I think, too. But I had enough insight as a teenager to realise that the classes that I went to on a Friday afternoon and the kind of tribe of weirdos that were in the class alongside me were like probably the kind of the most anxiety free of the week. Like those moments, those hours, they were the most occupying, and kind of body and mind. And I thought I had enough, I suppose, to say, awareness to think, well, if that's what this can offer me, then, and I can go and at least study it, I should do that for the next 3 years at least, because that was the length of the degree program. So I think that was smart. I'll give teenage me a little credit for that. And I mean, after that, I didn't, going into it, I didn't have a particular route in mind. And it has taken me, I think, a really long time to kind of find, this groove, which I think really works for me. But doing the course and I guess we had an internship between 2nd and 3rd year, and I worked as an actor through that internship. But like, it wasn't just that the kind of acting piece, it was all the stuff that went around it, just seeing how the show got made, and we got to kind of contribute to devising a show. So if anything was a kind of an inciting incident, it was the opportunity to be taken seriously as a professional when you still hadn't come out of college, I guess.
It's fascinating to hear you describe the very beginning of it to be the insight of realizing that this group of people I'm meeting once a week are devoid of anxiety, and that if I can spend 3 years amongst this, it's time really well spent. Yeah. And the other thing I'm sort of hearing there, which is something that I recognize as well, is that sense of being allowed to make work at a young age sort of unleashes something to a degree, or it sounds like it unleashed something in you, sort of other, or would I be right in suggesting other sort of professionals giving a younger person the opportunity to make stuff, and that platform, that was kind of key?
Yeah, it definitely was. And as I say, like being with other people who sort of did, you know, like there was a sense that we were a little bit of a band of misfits in one way, and that was good. I suppose like I've always been a person who's had a busy mind, and not in the best way. Do you know what I mean? Like I can get a little sort of mentally agitated. But like the thing that I find really brilliant about that I found then as a teenager and even now is that like the kind of process of making theatre, whether that's, you know, as a director or an actor, is so occupying as to kind of demand all of your focus. So it's that's the thing that I'm after all the time, you know, is to be able to be single-minded rather than sort of splitting your attention in various directions. That feels really good, I think, somehow.
So what I'm hearing is that like the demands of making theatre or being an artistic director give you that sense of just being occupied, that allows you to focus fully.
I mean, I really find that with you know, with performing, because, you know, like it requires you to be present, you know, to such an extent that you really can't afford to be like thinking about your laundry or whatever. Do you know what I mean? Or you know, if you can, that's quite a mental feat. But it's the kind of body and mind, the kind of occupation of body and mind, and the two being kind of together in concert. You know, that's a really good feeling, I think. And I suppose that has extended over time to becoming, I suppose, maybe a bit of an evangelist for that experience, and for, you know, for when theatre is really good and we're all there in the room. And it's the experience too, I think, of being an audience member, because good theatre can, I think, transport you or allow you to transcend whatever is your daily grind, put you in the, you know, the space of the story or the world of the story that's being told, and offer you something, whether that's a reflection on kind of yourself or your world, or kind of a window into somebody else's, you know. So I suppose maybe that's what I'm chasing, like, or sort of trying to like peddle all the time, is that kind of opportunity for a little bit of transcendence from daily reality a little bit. Jesus, that sounds desperately philosophical. Oh my God.
I think you're allowed. I think as an artistic director of a theatre, I think, yeah, if you want to be that, yeah, that's the kind of thing you should be saying. But it sounds like it's, you know, and something I'd recognise as well, is that kind of full-on holistic mind and body, everything's happening. I'm not lost in my head, or, you know, I'm completely enthralled in what's going on. I spent a lot of time speaking to kind of drama students who are leaving drama school now in the middle of the pandemic, or going into their final year and that kind of thing. And it can be, at least for myself, very hard to think back exactly what the obstacles were when I sort of left, because it was a good 15, 20 years ago. So you tend to forget. But I imagine for you that there were, on reflection, some obstacles between that kind of 16 to 25 block. I think a lot of artists, whether it be the opinions of their local community or their parents, or maybe just trying to find where it is that they fit in, or, you know, making the decision to finally commit to going into you know, an artistic career. But what for you would have been, or were there any kind of challenges in that period that you notice in reflection now, actually?
Yeah, I mean, definitely. So not like partially it was a challenge to not know what I wanted to do, and because I'd had that experience of like working as an actor on that internship piece, I was like, oh, maybe I'll go and do that. And I guess I had a couple of teachers who said, you know, you're good at that, you know. Anyway, so I decided I was gonna, and I liked it, so I was like, okay, maybe I'll go and try that or whatever. But I remember I had a teacher who's a great friend say to me, you know, it's really difficult to work as an actor. And he said, you know, and to I think earn a living, I suppose, is what he really meant. He was like, you kind of maybe need to be pals with Cillian Murphy or Colin Farrell, you know, and get a kind of a bit in the side of some movie that they're on, or, you know, set up a company and make your own work. And I suppose, like, I mean, he was being a little bit kind of like slightly jokey, but I guess what he was getting at, and I'm reading a book about this at the moment as well, is like, you know, we do work in a world that is very governed by inequalities, and where some of the obstacles to getting on are to do with like your networks and how connected you are, and those kinds of things. And also, so like, I'm living in like smaller cities and towns, it's much harder to make a viable living, you know. We all know that because we're not in Cork or Waterford or whatever anymore, and you know, that kind of thing. So and to, yeah, so that's those kinds of challenges existed for me. And so I decided though that I would stay in Cork. This would have been 2004, and because I'd had the experience of the internship, that had given me really valuable sort of connections and contacts, you know. And so basically I got my first professional gigs. Like, I hadn't even done my exams at work, at school, at college, and I got my first professional acting gig. So I was like, I'm made. But and it caused a little bit of friction at home, because the gig clashed with a family wedding that I was supposed to be traveling for, and my family weren't that happy that I was choosing work over family. But I suppose that not that like I do that all the time, but like, it's set a pattern that, like, you know, you have to sort of, you do have to follow the work to a certain extent, and the work is a jealous lover in that regard, you know. But so I made the case to my mother that, like, you know, she had been very perturbed by the fact that I was studying drama at all, and here I was getting a, you know, sort of like my first paid gig, not even done with college, not even graduated. So she relented ultimately. But yeah, so I decided then I was going to be an actor after having been an actor once paid. And I guess it was going into Cork being the capital of culture in 2005. And so maybe naively, we kind of all thought there was going to be like piles of work around. And like, I picked up a couple of paid gigs, but like by and large, I was doing a lot of working for free, you know, which is a really good thing to do if you can afford to do it. And of course I could, because I was in my home city and all this stuff was happening, and I was still living at home, and I was working my part-time job, so I had enough income to kind of keep me going. So I had all of those privileges afforded me in that time. And I made some really crucial contacts actually, again. So like, I was able to kind of grow my network through that year, even though I didn't realize that's what I was doing. I mean, I was kind of just really buzzed to be like that anybody was letting me in the door and anywhere to do anything. And that the following spring, so spring 2005, I auditioned for a show that was kind of, yeah, there was singing involved as well, musical thing or whatever. And I didn't get a part on it, but they were also advertising for an assistant to the director, not an assistant director, but an assistant, sort of more of a PA, I guess, type role. So anyway, I got that job, and there was no money for that job. But I wound up in the course of that production, like opening the second act of the show, dancing a tango with another dancer, and singing in the choir that was part of the show, and also acting as the kind of like person who did the laundry, which there was budget for. So basically I got to see the whole thing, the whole show from end to end, like, and from sort of top to bottom. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, literally. So it was kind of an amazing experience. And that the woman who produced that show, I went on then, I did a master's in between, but I went on to work with her as an apprentice producer in Dublin in 2007. So that was a really, really valuable experience. But again, I had quit my job and decided to go on the dole to do it. So yeah, and I did that like a good bit, I guess, over the course of many years, like on and off the dole, or, you know, subbing like gigs that weren't paying with dole money. Should I be putting this on the internet? I don't know. They can come looking for me. Yeah, but I guess that it's that there is that sort of, I'm hearing now in myself, that lingering thing of like, oh, I shouldn't have done that. But I don't know how else, you know, there was me and many more like me. Like, I don't know how else I would have done that, actually, you know. So that's, I mean, that now has informed like a very sort of a great passion in me for like shouting about universal basic income and, you know, those kinds of systems, in the hope that like that will be a silver lining that will come out of this awfulness, that we can agree that it doesn't make any sense for people working in creative professions to be sort of just treated as general types in the social welfare office, that's not helpful. But anyway, I'm like digressing now into things, but yeah, so I suppose there was those kinds of obstacles, but then privileges, like those kinds of like contacts and being able to build those things. I did a master's in between, as I say, and when I went on to Dublin in 2007, again I was like, I'll be an actor now. I need to be in Dublin. Cork, there's no jobs in Cork. I'll go, but I went and I sort of like, sure, I didn't know anything about anything. I didn't know how castings worked really, I had no audition technique, I hadn't done any of those things that, at least I had a degree, but like in terms of drama school, the kind of like the things that are really useful to you, like audition technique or taping or any of that, I had none of those skills. And in the end, by then, I suppose, like my safety nets were gone from me. Like I was paying rent, like paying Celtic Tiger rent in 2007 in Dublin. And so very quickly I was like, I just have to get a job doing something. And if it can be in the theatre, great. And so I got this role then, working with producer Maura O'Keefe as kind of her assistant producer then, which was an extraordinary year. So when I just, I figured, okay, I was good at that, so I could just pursue that, I guess. And I still got to be like on the gig and in the room and all of that. So that felt good enough for them, I
mean, hearing you talk about it, a lot will be familiar to my own, and you recognize a lot, but it does, hearing you talk about it, it does sound like quite a lot of challenges and difficulties. Like on a systemic level, the fact that there's just not the money there to allow artists not to have to scrimp and save to do it. And also this sort of the meritocracy idea. That's I think a very unhealthy delusion around the art. The idea that if I just work really, really hard and really, really focus, then of course I'll be Cillian Murphy, and the realities of that. So it feels like there's a lot of things that you overcome, and the not knowing. It feels like there's a sort of, each leg has been a case of, well, I don't know what happens in Dublin now. I don't know how to be an actor, but let's give it a go. And it feels like, from what you're talking about, that's a sort of something that you've had to become or learn to be comfortable with, or maybe it was something natural that you kind of acquired this comfortableness with that over time. But I wonder, hearing you talk about it, I wonder, because it is, I guess, a lot of time in the creative arts, opportunities arise, and you find yourself going, well, I seem to suit that. And so I guess identifying sometimes what is leading you or pushing you or drawing you to different positions and places at different times. And so do you have any sense for yourself what it is that sort of leads you to whatever?
Work. I'm sort of like pathologically inclined towards work, or maybe not, maybe it's nurture actually, but so my parents would have been very I suppose the values at home would have been very heavy on like graft and on hard work and the importance of that. So it's even now it's challenging to sort of spend like time that doesn't look busy, like kind of time that is a bit more like daydreaming and thinking and just stretching out into thinking and dreaming, I guess. But yeah, so like I suppose it is, I think someone's going to pay me to do that. I know I can do it. I feel confident. So that those are the things that are inclined, plus, and then the bonus of like I get to be in those spaces like where they do that stuff. Do you know what I mean? Even if I can't be like exactly the person who gets to do it, I mean, I wasn't an idiot either. Like we had, because we when we did, not, this is terrible, I don't mean like that other female actors are idiots, but like in my course we were all women. And the received wisdom at that time was that that it was a challenge for our teachers to find texts for us to perform. And and so I mean, kind of the like bar like a really small scattering of plays, it was really challenging to find, like, or the understanding I had was that like there are very few good parts for, and you know, and it was clear that the parts, and this is still the case, like focus on like you're a young woman, and then you're a woman, like, you know, an older woman, more mature woman, and there's kind of very little in between. And so the competition for those parts was going to be very stiff. Do you know what I mean? And I suppose I'd always had a little bit more, I don't know, I guess I felt at that point like I could control the work around the producing work more than I could, you know. I had to sort of offer those decisions up to somebody else as an actor, and I found that enormously challenging, the idea of that, you know. So I guess so maybe in part then what I'm following or what's leading me is somehow the kind of the capacity to be in control of the decision making and not to have to surrender that, you know.
I mean, it sounds also as well around the possibilities. So where are the possibilities, and also what it's like to be in that room, because presumably, you know, you can graft in a mine if grafting was the only value you're working from, but there's something about being in that room with people, and then what are the possibilities? So even if it is a case of it's not a meritocracy and we're in Waterford or we're in Cork, you know, given what I love, where are the possibilities where I am? Am I off the page slightly?
No, you're not at all. And definitely, so like after having spent that year in Dublin, I went back to Cork with a really fervent sense of, you know, wanting to commit to that city and that place, and seek out the possibilities there, and to sort of go, well, it's not that one city over another is sort of inherently more cultural or more artistic. It's about the communities that coalesce around those places, you know, for one reason or another. So I became really kind of committed or interested in this idea that, you know, that like that didn't have to be the capital city for me or for anybody else. So the project for kind of the next, like, I guess 12 years really, or the thing that kind of the current that was underpinning all those things was about really making that contribution to like a cultural life in Cork, like for me to enjoy, but also for like, you know, collaborators, colleagues, and people who, you know, the wider world could enjoy as well, because I think it's important. You know, I don't think it's healthy. I mean, you know, it's mad now to see like how cities like Dublin are like emptying out, you know, when the office blocks don't have their workers in them or whatever. And you kind of think, actually, what is there really? Because they've, you know, the prices have pushed artists out. But then there's places like, I don't know if you've been back to Callan in Kilkenny, where there's a really interesting enclave of artists like working in that town, you know, which is super rural, but it's kind of incredible. So I'm fascinated by the richness in that as well. And I think, yeah, seeking out those possibilities for sure.
Wow. So another driver there is really making and enhancing a community. So, you know,
definitely.
And I can reflect that as well from just walking around central London, and friends that I would know in the area that just don't go to central London because there's no point, because there's no arts, no West End, nothing's happening. And so zone 1 of central London is pointless without, it appears, any culture happening in it. So that's really interesting. And I guess something around what you're talking there around community really interests me. And something you mentioned around sort of building a network as well, because this, I guess, comes up quite a lot in these talks as being particularly key. And I think it can be something that can be very difficult for a lot of artists. I definitely would have had, I think as an actor, quite often you probably choose this. I definitely recognize it, but you can put yourself or feel like you're put in a position of being very much outside of an industry that you might see as above you, the decision makers being separate to you. And so the relationship you have with the industry can sway between, oh, I have a job and I'm right in the industry, to I don't have a job and they hate me. And so there's something around navigating the relationship of you as an individual potential outsider and this community. And I'm always interested in the ways people have done that, to kind of integrate themselves into community and build a network that allows them to create work with their peers. And so I wonder, in your own experience, on reflection, what's worked for you with that over the years?
Yeah, I think you're really like on the ball with that. Like the experience of being in Dublin that in 2007, like the best of times were when you're on the gig, or when the show was up and running, and then of course you get that awful blues period when it's not. And I was kind of working from home and had the dishwasher to empty for company, kind of like on your tea break. And I you know I found that very lonely. And so when I came back to Cork, um I suppose like I started working with I started working for a couple of different companies, and over the course of those years, I suppose I built up a kind of a peer group. In 2011, Cork opened the Theatre Development Centre in Cork, and there was a kind of a series of conversations that Theatre Forum hosted at the time, where a bunch of people sort of, had ideas about what should happen in that space. It having absolutely nothing to do with them on one level, but like everything to do with them, on another. And of course, I was one of those. So me and some others, we formed a steering committee, along with like Pat Kiernan, who had been the person who'd given me that first professional gig all those years ago, and the internship or whatever. But the thing that arose out of it was like people were able to spend time in that room developing whatever, like an idea. A show might be, too early to be a show, but an idea anyway. And the idea of it then was that on a Friday evening, it would be shown to people, to the wider community for free, and there would be some sort of like discussion after the fact. So the principles of that are extremely simple. And it doesn't really exist in those terms anymore, but it was an extraordinary period. Those the kind of 3 years, kind of 11, 12, 13, because it introduced me to a whole pile of other people out there in Cork City. There's a kind of a language around, a shared language kind of like grows around the work that you're seeing, or all of that. And there was a sense that like you could kind of just kind of walk up to someone and say, come here, I'm working on this in a few weeks' time. Will you, if you're free, can you come in the room with me and test something out? So it's also, I think it's really healthy to have a practice that goes on outside of like being on the gig, to have something that sustains you through that, and like whether if you're an actor, I guess it's about like keeping the muscles kind of like match fit, on one level. But I think if you're a maker, there's sort of like creative muscles that you have to keep match fit as well. And so that we were able to do that there and then. And so this would have been like between 2008, which is when I came back, and 2011, that was like the whole crash happened there. I had been working for a company full time, was made redundant as a result of like the Arts Council kind of cutting companies all over the country. So that system that I had emerged into, which was quite supportive, I'd had an internship, I'd had my first jobs, I'd had, these kind of crucial roles, through companies that were being funded by the Arts Council. I'm really conscious that that doesn't really exist for people anymore, coming out of college or whatever. That's really, I think that's terrible. But so, oh God, I'm digressing now, sorry. But anyway, that was an extraordinary thing to have, a resource to have at that time. And I think that's the crucial point anyway, is that idea that you can keep a practice going outside of like being on the gig,
And it sounds like for you, what allowed that was the space and the people. So being back in Cork, you had this theatre development centre that I imagine was easy to access that space, and you had a set of peers, like you said, who you could grab off the street, not in an abusive kind of way, and work with. So that facility was there, and that enabled. So I guess it's to a degree maybe about practice-wise allowing yourself to, or finding who and where you can practice to a degree.
Yeah.
This is slightly off of careers, but also I think really connected to it. We're in the middle of COVID, and obviously there's a international crisis, as I don't need to inform you. And I guess for a lot of people in the industry at the moment and entering the industry, it's sort of, it's hard to get a coherent vision of what's happening. And so I'm really interested in your perspective, because I imagine as an artistic director, you are meeting people at every level within the industry and within different institutions. what's your sense? Because I've been following the National Campaign for the Arts and sitting in one or two of those meetings, which has been incredible to be a part of the community despite being miles from it. But what's your sense of how the arts in Ireland is being seen differently, or has it been seen differently? What's changed?
It's really hard. It's hard to measure that. I know, like, there was a piece in the weekend by the director of the Arts Council, Maureen Kennelly, and she was saying that she felt there was a change, but I don't know. That's a really difficult thing to kind of quantify, really. And I mean, what you're really looking for is a change in political will. So like that is quantifiable. Like we've had, the talks that the NCFA have resulted in, more money being kind of like flushed through the Arts Council, and that's a good thing. So I guess that's a way of saying, yes, that, people are aware, the political class is aware that needs to happen or whatever. But it's a thing of like, if that's just an emergency response, like this needs to happen like over a sustained period of time. Like things were very badly wrong before, like, and we need to try and fix them. I mean, I sort of feel a little bit, I do feel optimistic about things like, universal basic income, that this is a real opportunity for us to try and change that around, but yeah, in terms of like the kind of like broader public perception, I don't know if you've been following, there was maybe a little tension between the groups that are representing the interests, we'll say, of the more the kind of commercial events sector. So that's like, everybody from like people who run like Electric Picnic through to like people who have stalls kind of at the ploughing championships type thing. Excuse me. So there was a little bit of tension between the kind of the funded arts, we'll say, and the non-funded arts, and I was disappointed to see some of the rhetoric around that from people working in the commercial event sector, but also like from colleagues. So where there was sort of mutual disdain, really, and I think that's a shame, because like for me, what I was also doing like through all those years, when I wasn't really making that much money, like kind of from, well, I wasn't making any money at all from the theatre, but I was singing in a wedding band for a long time, and that was how I earned my living, so. And my husband still works in that business, or doesn't right now, he's not gigging. So like I have people who are in that kind of world where, kind of gigging musicians in that world, as opposed to like maybe the more kind of funded arts sector, like, those are my friends. And so I can see both sides of that, or I have the, the capacity, or I'm afforded the opportunity to see both sides of that. So I think it's a real pity to see any kinds of just sniping, really, because I think we'd achieve more by being together. But I think that is also happening, because I think that basically the sniping will just undermine both sectors in the kind of public eye. What the public needs to know is that, like, we're really keen to get back to work. We work really hard, and we put on events that are really safe for people to attend. Like, these are the kinds of things that we'll be trying to convince people of, But I do think it's difficult when, I suppose, like, if it's hard to for I guess people who are like politicians, I suppose is what I mean, to understand what the value of those things are if they haven't had a kind of a direct engagement. Like, most kids will at least have played sports growing up, and that's prioritized in schools in the way that like kind of arts participation isn't. Mm-hmm. And that creates a huge systemic problem, like from like all the way down, all right up to the top, because it's not prioritized. Then it continues to not be prioritized when somebody who hasn't had access to the arts has power and controls the budgets that we need their help with. So like, there is a lot of things to fix there, and I'm focusing on things like universal basic income, but like, yeah, there are huge issues there for sure.
Well, that's really interesting to hear you say, because it sounds like there's two ways of going about making change there. One is the political top-down, and the other is sort of a grassroots arts participation. And I think the point you make around people in Ireland and England, I would say, not having that hands-on experience of, say, theatre in the same way they would have with sports. Because a lot of the challenges that I would definitely meet in people in the industry would be this sense of, I'm working really hard to do something that society as a whole is quite publicly saying is pointless and doesn't deserve money. And that I have seen definitely causes a real challenge, a real barrier for artists and creators of every kind who are really struggling at the moment. And so that's a difficult thing to manage, which is, I guess, where that question came from. Which sort of brings me on in a similar line. I guess I'd started these series of talks with the vague idea of talking about what it is to live well as a creative. And that idea probably came to my head in January of this year. So it's always a matter of survival, but obviously we're in very different territory now. And I guess I've been debating on my own head as to, what's the difference between living resiliently and living well? And are they kind of the same, or are they not? I'm not sure. But I'd be interested, given that, we've both been through a recession and a pandemic, and I'm sure those will both shift, and there'll be more recessions and pandemics, who knows? But from your perspective, what would you say, what is it to be resilient in the arts in Ireland?
God, I don't know. I mean, I say I don't know because I often don't feel sufficiently resilient myself, or I've felt myself sort of buffered by the winds of change in lots of different ways. And, even though my circumstances have changed, I sometimes find myself falling foul of the same sort of issues, or, like definitely, had a kind of a recent enough, like last year, kind of a fairly rough period of burnout. And even though like I'm in a paid role now, like the last time I would have had burnout that acute was in 2013, when I was really struggling to like just to kind of pay my bills and all of those kinds of things. And I think I might have put it down to those kinds of practical challenges. But there's something to do, well, I suppose I've been thinking a lot in the last few months about like tendency to a little bit of like work addiction, or to be on the treadmill a little bit of like the buzz from the gig, and then the kind of falling off of that, and not allowing enough time for reflection about like what went well. And I've been talking to some other kind of peers and colleagues about this as well. Like I think we're enormously resilient because we sort of, we stay going, and we all do the kind of like quoting Beckett, and we say, I'll go on, kind of thing. But I don't think living resiliently and living well are the same thing, really, to be honest. Because I think we erode ourselves as we go, when the resilience is all there is. Do you know what I mean? And when we don't leave enough space for wellness. And I know there's kind of like, there's a huge industry dedicated to wellness at the moment, but some of it existed long before it was packaged in that way. And particularly like people working in theatre practice, or actors, like things like a yoga practice or a breath practice, like those are not that's not new. Do you know what I mean? But yeah, so I think it's a funny thing, because I think that like more resources, like in terms of just your pay, can obviously really change your life. Like, do you know what I mean? It really changed my life. The month before I got the job in the Everyman, I was the poorest I had been in like 10 years. I was so poor, because also my Dole money had run out, which was part of the problem. And I suppose that doesn't leave you really on one level. So, even though like, I had a job back in March when we went into lockdown, it was that kind of sudden panic, that you weren't going to be able to kind of pay your own way, and what that would mean for you, for me, for my identity, you know what I mean? Because my work is so bound to that. And I'm not sure how healthy that is, actually. Like, on one level it's a driving force, it kind of, it pushes me and keeps me going, but I'm not my work though either, like, so there's a kind of I've been thinking about that, those kinds of things, I guess, And I'd love to think that like one of the things that, you know, so many of us who fall out of those types of things could bring forward after this is like if there were sufficient resources that like we'd be able to make a little bit more time for and space for living a little bit better, you know, rather than just resiliently.
It's really refreshing to hear you talk about it, I think really realistically, because quite often I think people, I think resilience is already being bandied about as a sort of a word, and I'd imagine we're just going to hear nonstop that for quite some time. But I think quite often the impression can be that it's an impenetrable thing of perfection. So, you know, living resiliently is just not being affected by it. And so it's I think really important to hear someone talk about, well, actually, yeah, my resilience has been just sitting with, at times, really awful stuff and it being really difficult. But also, I'm hearing you talk about just the very natural things of there being some aspects that, you know, there's a workaholism, I think, that when you are freelance particularly, I think is really seductive because it gives a kind of a form. And it sounds like what you're saying is that taking that room for reflection and space is in some way very important, but ideally not to be constantly eroded away in that sense that resilience kind of implies, like you're being grinded down. So I guess what I'm sort of taking from what you're saying there is that is that you will have these periods of being eroded, but there need to be times when there is without that as well. It's not a case of, it shouldn't be a case of consistent pressure over time, but there needs to be some space that either you create for yourself in some way or is created for you. Is that?
Yeah. But you're right on it because and the problem is really, as you say, that the work is so seductive. So it pulls you back in every time and you think, oh, actually, this is fine. I do love this. It loves me. It's all grand, you know, and so that does sort of like replenish you to an extent. Do you know what I mean? So there is a restorative like built into the work, I think, on one level, which aids the kind of like the process of resilience or whatever. But I think, I don't know, I just see it now in a way that like it's the context that we're all living in, which makes it much harder, you know, where like rent is outrageous and, you know, it's just impossible for people to live. Like it was easier to live like as a poor artist kind of 15 years ago, I think, or even before that, than it is now. The cost of living is so high. Yeah, and we're, you know, those divides in the world, like at large, are just getting bigger. Like they really mean it when they say the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer. That's what's happening, you know.
Yeah, I mean, I live in London because I couldn't afford to live in Dublin, really. I see those rents.
Wow.
And you can get cheaper places in London. But one thing that, to a degree, I think is sort of maybe a clue as to where things might go are the ways in which I know a lot of artists have just fled London to go back to places because they didn't need to be here, where they can write, actually, at home. And what you're talking about, is it Callan in Kilkenny, this little enclave of... and so maybe there is room for you know, new sprouting different places in a way that is economically viable. Maybe there are more options out there. And to finish up with, I'm always sort of really fascinated when I sort of meet people in the arts, because as soon as you get talking to them, you realize that, oh, there's a whole other world of stuff that they are thinking about doing. They're not just the person they just met. Actually, there's a whole lot of other stuff they're considering, or, you know. So yeah, what is on the horizon for you? What are you excited about work-wise going forward? What has your interests?
Well, yeah, so like I'm at the beginning of this 3-year contract here in Bray. So like the things that I'm really buzzed about are trying to meet the challenges of like this mad like uncertainty. Like how do we program for that? How do I, in the context where there's like very limited capacity, how do I hold on to the relationships that organization has built up with the public when I can't have them into an event? Like how do I figure that out? You know, we have to write a strategic plan now soon. Once we have an Arts Council application due shortly, but once that's done, it's strategic planning time. So I'm kind of looking forward to that. And yeah, I mean, like, you know, when I took the job, I said to myself, you know, it'll either prove to be a very brave move or a very stupid move. So, but at the moment I'm erring on the side of it feeling brave rather than stupid, you know. Because there's massive challenges there, but like I'm buzzed up by all of that, you know. There's loads of things that I don't know, like, you know, Mermaid has a multidisciplinary remit, so we have a gallery space, you know, and visual art isn't my background at all, so I have loads of things to learn there. But like, you know, I am fascinated by the work and by the artists who make it. So like, I feel that's a good enough compass needle to follow in that regard. Do you know what I mean? And I'm also really excited about Bray and about Wicklow broadly. Wicklow is so beautiful. I don't know, like, have you ever spent any time here? But like, I mean, they mean it when they call it the Garden County. It's incredible. And so where I'm living now is like, I can walk to the beach and I can be in the sea, like sort of within 20 minutes, which is awesome. So I suppose I'm really excited to get to know it as a place, and to know the people here, and to understand what, you know, what community means for people here, and how, you know, how art lives inside that and animates that, I guess.
Well, it sounds like you're going to make something incredible there. It sounds like everything that's needed is there, and I love, the idea of, I think encapsulates the whole idea of a career in the arts. Decisions, steps made between brave and stupid. Then that kind of rings a bell for me.
That sounds like a book title, Andrew. That's great.
No, it's all your, all your words. Julie Kelleher, thank you so much for taking the time out this evening to have a chat with me. I really appreciate your honesty and just directness about your experience. I think it has been really useful for me, and I have been mentally taking notes throughout. So thank you again for your time.
No worries at all. Pleasure. Thank you.